Rachel, thanks so much for coming on the Mindful Parenting Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking to you. We have lots of important things to talk about, some like slightly uncomfortable things to talk about, as always happens when we talk to people who are sexuality education people on the Mindful Parenting Podcast. But that's here. But first, I want to start with a little about you because I always think it takes a very special person to want to go into the work of like teaching people about sexuality. So I'm just curious about you and your childhood. What was your childhood like and how were you raised?
Sure. Well, I think of my childhood as quite a happy one. I always felt safe, loved, and nurtured. I grew up in the DC suburbs, and both of my parents were present and encouraging of all of my interests and my curiosities and were involved in my life. And my younger brother is a key part of all of my memories, though we bickered like crazy. I was also so protective of him and parental to him.
Were you the oldest child?
Yes, just the two of us. And we were close with my extended family, got to spend a lot of time together doing fun things, going to meaningful places. And I think in terms of my own sexuality education, I was very lucky to have parents who answered my many questions and took me to the library to find resources to fill in so much information I wondered about. And I would say pretty close to completely shame-free environment where my parents would share their values and hopes for me, but then ask me about mine as those developed. And I'm very grateful for that, as I know very much that that experience is not universal.
Yeah. I mean, we hope that we would want to create a shame-free environment, but I know that's definitely very far from the truth and what's happening in our country in a lot of different places. But maybe you can talk to that, like this idea of a shame-free environment. Like, what is it? Is it that your parents created for you that, and what did that do for you? Or what does the idea of a shame-free environment do for kids as they're developing?
I think, bodies, everybody has a body, and bodies as sort of this neutral and, often positive thing that do plenty of things for us. And so in terms of a shame-free body, like I didn't really grow up thinking that any of my body parts were shameful or wrong. They just were, and they deserved health. And it was okay to talk about them if there was, especially if there was anything going wrong. My parents would want to know, and also just to kind of think about sex and sexuality and a sexual self as this lifelong thing that had a lot of both responsibility and also pleasure. And just kind of exploring your own body and your own privacy and not really being told that that was a terrible thing or that anything terrible would happen if you got to know your body in that type of way. I think it allowed me to be a healthier and more communicative adult as well, just kind of not having really, really deep and sort of reinforced hang-ups about my body being bad or sexuality being bad or like self-touch being bad.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I think my parents strived for that. Like they tried to be like, sort of open hippies, but it was like the early 80s, and like they would like walk around the house naked, and so would my brother, who was 2.5 years older, and I was like, this is horrible, don't do this, no. And I was like considered like the prude of the house, and I guess in a weird way, like not really shame, but kind of like they kind of were like, what's wrong with you, Hunter's like ruining our nice open hippie thing. I was like,
Wow.
oh, I was like,
Well,
no.
that's such a fabulous example of consent, though, right? Because there's a way in which people's liberation is really wonderful, but everybody's comfort and everybody's consent is actually really valuable. So there are differing levels of when people might crave something like privacy, or when people might crave a little bit more modesty. Like those aren't bad words, and so to be able to say like my most comfortable environment or my safest environment is one where I don't show off my body or I'm not seeing anybody else's body right now is also, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Sometimes I listen to the Armchair Expert podcast, and I thought that was really interesting because the host Dex Shepard was talking about how in their family they've done that kind of like people are naked, and then he was like, and I'm just kind of like looking out for clues that at some point this will be not like a cool thing for my kids. And I was wondering, like, what would that be? Like, would it be like me being like, stop it? Or would it be something else? Like, if somebody's in a household like that, I don't know, maybe you could tell us.
Well, I think that's an interesting question because, one of the things that I talk with families so much about is that family norms and family comfort as kind of a unit, they come together because everybody's curious about each individual perspective. And we don't often ask young children about their perspective. We normally say, like, here are the rules, you can follow them, and here are the consequences when you do not follow them. But with something like shared family values or shared family norms, those usually come to be with conversation and hopefully with more communication, even if it comes up in this sort of nonverbal, like, to me, that tells me that, young you might have been feeling discomfort. And so maybe a parent can lean into that and say, oh, it seems like you're feeling uncomfortable. Do you feel okay telling me a little bit about that? Or what in this situation might make you feel more comfortable? And those are the foundational tools of consent conversations with our kids, to be able to say, I just heard, like, I just witnessed a nonverbal display, and I want to know more about that so everybody feels safe and comfortable here.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm wondering, like, you have the language of, I just witnessed a nonverbal display, but not everybody would probably use that language.
Yeah.
They might say something more like, it looked like from, your body and how you were reacting that you don't feel so good about something like that.
Yeah,
Right? You
and
might
of
say something more like
course,
that. Yeah.
yeah, shifting everything to developmentally appropriate language. Like, I don't think I would say nonverbal display to the 3.5-year-old in my house, but we do
Your
talk a
nonverbal
lot
display.
about. Yeah, right. We do talk a lot about your body is showing me, or I'm seeing that. And I think
Yeah.
that when we talk about consent at every age, teaching consent at every age, I think how parents begin conversations at a developmentally appropriate level is a question I often get, because obviously it evolves as kids grow older, but even with like a pre-verbal child, with a very, very young child, it can be as simple as beginning to narrate what you're doing as you're doing a diaper change, explaining anatomically correct names for body parts as they learn words, or reinforcing those very simple ideas about what they are allowed to say yes and no to, and really celebrating their yeses and their nos. I do or I don't like that. Saying to a pre-verbal child, oh, it looked like you didn't like that squeeze, so we're not going to squeeze that way anymore. Or it looked like you did not like it when the doggy kissed your face. Let's keep your body safe and move them away. And then I think as it evolves with my toddler, we continue that respect for bodily autonomy by not making them hug or kiss anyone they don't want to, not forcing them to share something really special, and instead inviting them to see the natural benefit or consequence of how they play and interact, and kind of helping them begin to make independent choices about things like how much food their belly needs from their dinner plate, things that help them get in touch with their body and their power, and again, narrating the safety pieces of the puzzle when you have to do things for their safety, like, I need to cut your nails to keep your body and my body safe, so which nail should we cut first? Or I had to grab your body because you were about to run into the street, and it's my job to keep your body safe, and plenty of that repetition about when they might be upset at not having full control.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because I think like when we talk about teaching consent, we think about it in a young age. Like that's such a great place to start. It's like consent in all kinds of ways, right? Like
Totally.
consent in, yeah, it's okay for you to say no if somebody wants to touch your hair, or if you don't want to give someone a hug, or even like non-touch things, right? Like
Oh, very
there are
much.
a lot of great ways to teach consent. I don't know. I'm blanking right now. Maybe you can help me on some examples.
Of non-sexual ways to teach consent?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. I think the sharing example is a really good one. The food example is a really good one. The comfort with space between you and an animal or you and another person example. Like there's so many ways that we talk about being empowered to say yes or say no or say I'm comfortable or I'm not comfortable with that and be able to set boundaries.
Okay, so but what if there are places where you you are wanting to, like, for food, for example, right?
Sure, sure.
So there's like there's a lot, people have a lot of different
So many.
opinions about food. We know that when kids get to be moving,
Mm-hmm.
that they start to really dislike bitter foods that often are vegetables and things like that, because maybe it's because we evolved, and once they start moving, we don't want them just eating random plants if we were hunter gatherers, right?
So true.
So, but we also know that, like, nobody maybe loves broccoli the very first time they taste it, just like no one loves beer the first time they taste beer, right? Or coffee, or but then we end up like loving this thing that we stick with. So, take food. Like in our house, we had a rule that you don't have to eat it, but you must taste it. And we explained this rule because it was very much because, yeah, like you're not going to like things that you are ultimately going to really love at first, the first couple times you taste it, because you have to get used to it. Your mouth gets used to it. Like, and we explain that, you know, mommy and daddy drink beer and wine and we love it. Like, we hated it the first couple times we tasted it, or coffee, and we explained it, some things like that. But if we're also wanting to teach consent, we want kids to be able to say no when they want to say no, or yes when they want to say yes. But then maybe in this case, like, we're actually kind of wanting them to be like, yeah, you want to say no, but I want you to say yes right now, just at least a little bit. Like, how would you navigate like a situation like that?
Yes, and we navigate it all the time. I mean, our 3.5-year-old has the beigest of beige plates all of the time.
I know, yeah, you don't want the beige plate forever, right?
We don't. And I think, there are a couple of things that align with our family values. We love to try new things. We love to give something a chance before we say we don't like it. And so we will definitely encourage tasting new things, or one thing to try. But we take the approach of having a learning bowl, and he knows that if he smells it, if he feels it, if he boops it, with his mouth or with his tongue, or if he takes a bite, that he never has to swallow anything that tastes really yucky, or anything that he's not a fan of, and then he can say, no, thank you, that's not my favorite. And he says that to most new things, but it's not an expectation, it's an invitation. And again, this is a conversation about shared family values and aligning with family values. Of course there are going to be things that he has to do for his health, but I'm not going to die on the hill that eating this broccoli is like really the thing I'm going to force him to do, if he's really not comfortable with doing it. Will I encourage him to feel it, to learn something about it, to boop it a little bit, to like know something about its smell or its texture or its taste? Sure. But I think that it has helped to kind of give him final say of what goes into his body. And the same thing, like, we're not clean plate club kind of people either. We're not going to make him sit and finish a plate. We want him to be able to have a little bit more body trust, where he can decide, I feel hungry or I feel full. And that doesn't mean we give him free reign. We decide what's on the menu and he decides what goes into his body. And we always try and make sure there are a couple of his safer foods on the menu, for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, obviously I should say, like, along with
sure,
you must taste it, came along with, like, yeah, and you can spit it out if you don't like it.
Yep.
I mean, I think people are afraid that teaching kids, might be afraid that teaching kids consent and bodily autonomy means that, like, you can say no to your parents, and parents are worried about, like, disobedience, right, for kids' safety or different reasons, right, and for the feeling of respect and things like that. What do you say do you come across that as an issue? And, like, what do you say to a parent who might be worried about that?
I think so. I think it usually comes because as parents or new parents, we're speaking from our own experiences, and generationally there is a pretty big divide between the mutual respect between parent and child versus the type of obeying, like, you will do it because I said so. And I think that takes a lot of unpacking and relearning. And, like we don't just roll over and like take it when our kid is being mean or destructive in our house. There's consequences for behaviors. Like we use the all emotions are welcome, all behaviors are not in our house, which I think has been really useful. But disobedience doesn't mean for me what I think it might mean in the minds of more authoritarian style parents. Because for me, if I'm witnessing disobedience, again, verbally or non-verbally, I'm thinking, there's an unmet need here. And that's my frame as a therapist, of course. So we're, sitting in the corner talking with a 3.5-year-old about feelings a lot more than the average household, I think. But yeah, when I think about disobedience, I'm thinking about if there's a behavior I need to stop, sure, I can, keep a body safe or like help with a consequence or even just kind of watch a natural consequence occur. But I'm not super interested in obedience for the sake of obedience in terms of a power struggle with me and my kid. I want to be able to respect my kid and to say, yeah, I'm the parent and you're the kid, and that means I have to make way more decisions and I do have more power and control, but I'm not really interested in wielding that in a way just to show that I can. I don't necessarily think that makes a kid have like an intrinsic wish to follow those rules.
No, quite the opposite, actually. And so you're at one end with a 3.5-year-old. My 17.5-year-old just biked by my window, going to do her chocolate wrapping job. And
Nice.
and I have to say that now at the other end, at 17, it really does, for those, maybe dear listener, you're listening to Rachel and saying, "Oh, I don't know, that sounds a little scary,
Too
right?"
gentle, too gentle.
It actually does work to, like, when you show your kids respect and respect their opinions and listen to them and model that and have this gentler way of doing things, that my kids do respect me in a major way, and they do listen to me, and they do care about what I think too. So when, giving what you want to receive in some way,
Sure.
it may seem like it's not for the listener. Like it may seem like, oh, I'm sort of like trusting that this will work someday, like when your kids are really little. But I want to just say that as somebody who is like, oh gosh, I hope this will ultimately be okay. It is.
I'm so glad to hear. I'm so glad to hear that, because I also think that there's a confusion between authoritative parenting and permissive, right? Like my house isn't some house where we just have no boundaries and no rules and no consequences, and we're just like, we are ceding power to the 3.5-year-old, because I don't think kids necessarily benefit from that either.
No, that doesn't feel safe.
No, it's not safe. And again, it's a mutual respect, right? So I think we're in the process of helping teach him, what is a welcome behavior. And you can always have your feelings and opinions about what's going on. You don't have to be happy about the boundary that I'm setting. And we can pause and really talk through your feeling about it. But the decision I made, the boundary doesn't actually change. And that can be disappointing and frustrating at times, but he also knows how to work through that disappointment and that frustration.
I love that. Okay, so what is an appropriate age to discuss the details of sex with kids? And now, and we know that now we're like we're more evolved human beings, and we know that not only do LGBTQ plus people exist, but that sex can mean many things, and it means maybe more than just like the heteronormative, like your
For sure.
A penis goes in a vagina and makes a baby, right? Like, because that's how it's been discussed for many years. So kind of from that inclusive lens, then, like, what is the age appropriate ways to talk about the details of sex, and what would you I'll let you take it from there.
It's a fantastic question. I think when a child is old enough to ask a question, they're usually old enough to get a developmentally accurate answer. So although there might be different ways of answering maybe a specific how is a baby made question, if your kid is 3 versus 6 versus 9, there are many honest answers at each of these ages that don't break their brains. And as you said, sexual orientation and gender identity are actually great topics to further that point because there's a clear and unfortunate discourse that is present politically now where there's this insistence that kids are just too young to even know what gay or trans means, and that those of us who are offering inclusive education are being explicit about specific sex acts, or we're grooming children with information that they don't need. And I'm not really sure what they're imagining those conversations looking like, but just to pull back the curtain, what is actually happening is that, a child like mine, for example, might have books or dolls or exposure to certain media where there are families just like his and families that are different than his, where there are representations of different families, different bodies, and diverse sets of people where that diversity might show up in race or religion or ability or sexual orientation and gender. So again, my 3-year-old is aware that some people with his body parts are boys and some are not. He's aware that people who love each other can be partners or live together and be married one day if they want to. He's aware that some families like ours have LGBTQ plus people in them and that is great. And that's cool for 3-year-olds. That's nearly it. The nuances might come a bit later. And about the age of 6 to 7 is when I've had folks let me know that my first book, The Everybody Book, has been a helpful tool for answering some of the questions that their kids have about sex, reproduction, scientifically accurate and inclusive language, and piece by piece, sort of based on the specific questions that the kid is asking at that time.
Yeah. So you sent me your new book, the Everybody Book of Consent, which I'm loving. And so we
I'm so
had
glad.
our podcast integrator get your other book, which you just mentioned, and she has younger kids, and she's like, "Oh my goodness, like I can see my son like really cringing and like really being very uncomfortable about reading this book." And I thought, well, then maybe that's like good that he could just have it to check out when nobody else is around, right? Do you find that your
Exactly.
books are used that way?
I do, because of the interesting age range, especially for the Everybody Book, which is marketed 7 to 12 years old. I find that those 6, 7, 8-year-olds are, maybe they'll go to their parents or ask a specific question. That parents will kind of open the book to a specific page and answer the question with this resource together. The 11, 12-year-olds, I would say, are the ones who kind of take the book, make no eye contact, sneak away to a corner and say, "Don't look at me, don't talk to me, I've got this." But it sort of depends. It sort of depends on the developmental sort of space that the kid is in, what specific questions they might have. We don't need to overwhelm a kid with answers to questions that they're not even asking for yet. That is a wonderfully, some parents with amazing intentions sort of are like, let's have this amazing, huge talk about sex and sexuality. But it's not always necessary, and kids kind of use the books as resources. I would say the Everybody Book of Consent is bigger words, maybe for 10 to 14-year-olds, the middle school age, and usually they're going to probably use that resource maybe a little bit more on their own.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was thinking, that it would be um, talking about it on their own. So, yeah. Well, if we're having these conversations, right? If a parent's having a conversation about, they've worked up the courage to read the book or to have a conversation, and they see like their kid is getting visibly uncomfortable, what should they do? Because maybe you might know, like, my kid's like 10, like they're probably seeing like whatever on their friends' phones on the bus. I don't want them to be uninformed. I want them to get information from me, but they're giving me signs that they're visibly uncomfortable. So, how
Right.
should parents navigate that kind of thing?
Right. The awkwardness is definitely to be expected. And I think we can all sort of remember our own conversations with parents or wherever we got the sources of sexuality information these days versus when we were growing up are really vast and sometimes really beyond what we would consider safe or appropriate for our own kids. So I like how you highlighted that, as parents, we also want to be a good and safe source of sexuality information because at the very least, hopefully we'll have better information than what is just randomly out there for kids. But I always encourage parents to kind of push through especially their own emerging discomfort, their own and their child's discomfort in the name of safety, because this is our job, our most important job, to keep our kids safe and being a safe person for them to have ongoing dialogue about all the topics under the massive umbrella of sex and sexuality is a great goal. But it often does include some eye rolls, some awkward moments, some like deep breaths. And I think, like we were talking about before, it's also okay to notice visible discomfort and name that and ask if the kid needs a break or name if you need a break. But I would say that I think an important reframing of sexuality in 2024 in our conversations with our kids is to move away from so many of our references or assumptions about the big talk, the birds and the bees talk, and towards that ongoing dialogue with kids that never really ends and isn't this one marathon conversation that the kids aren't even asking for. And my colleague, Al Vernacchio, in this area actually, teaches parents that sex talks don't boil down to one 1,000-minute conversation and instead having 1,000 one-minute conversations while your kid is running out the door that broach an array of topics and often span years and years. Because like you were saying before, consent is non-sexual most of the time. And wanting kids to build healthy sexual selves involves all of the non-sexual things like confidence, communication, self-reflection, self-advocacy, boundary setting. And these things can be really helped along by supportive and curious parents who encourage kids to think about these things early and often inside and outside of sexuality conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so you're a psychotherapist, you're an educator, you help young adults, right?
Yes,
Who
yeah.
maybe
Kids, teens, young
LGBT.
adults, parents,
Yeah,
families,
yeah, yeah.
all of the above.
So I'm wondering, like, if have you learned from, kids who are like, God, I wish my parents had been this.
Mhm.
What do you see as some of the mistakes that we parents make that may end up like driving a wedge between us and our kids,
Mhm.
or making things uncomfortable for them or making them feel unaccepted?
I think there are a couple of answers to that question. One is obviously silence. One is not talking about things at all. Two is coming from a place of shame. Sometimes that gets paired with religiosity, sometimes it doesn't at all, but kind of having this idea that there are behaviors and there are identities that are bad, and that, if you do this thing or if you are this thing, then you are bad, I think is a massive mistake and one with really impactful and lasting consequences to people's overall well-being and definitely their sexual well-being and their
Well, that's
health.
interesting
Yeah.
because like the idea of that can be mean us reflecting on also how we speak about things and issues and people around us
Exactly, exactly.
how we're talking about that. Are we being judgmental of our neighbors or the people in the news or the different things, like, and how are we speaking about that, and how is what are our kids picking
Yeah,
up
the
on,
kids are
right? What
picking up
those
on
messages.
everything. They're listening to everything, and I think that's one of the reasons why it can be so slippery and not intended, but the sort of heterosexist and cissexist way that we assume our kids' genders and sexualities from a very young age. I think I've sort of moved away from this idea that a lot of parents have offered, which is like, well, if my kid is queer or trans, then of course I'll love them no matter what. And I sort of take the position like, I don't know what my kid's gender or sexuality is yet. They'll figure it out along the way, and I'll hopefully help them figure it out along the way. And, I just don't assume going in cisness or straightness in most people I meet. I just kind of let them come to me and let me know what's going on. And I think there's an openness there where we sort of anticipate a day when maybe people don't need to come out in the same way, or it doesn't need to be this whole big thing, and we can only really have that day when cisness and straightness is not really this expected default of everybody around us. And as a partner to that, I would say another mistake I see parents make is to overload these conversations with their values and to say, well, like, here's what I believe about sex before marriage, or here's what I believe about, you know, pregnancy and abortion and all, you know, all of the things that might come across in these conversations. And I do think that those values are welcome, but if the conversation stops there and there really isn't an invitation for your kid to offer their own values, or maybe differ in their values, or maybe still be working on some of their values, I do think that those can be really what am I trying to say? Underutilized conversations. They're conversations that we don't have enough, I would say.
Okay. So yeah. So you know, but it's interesting because I'm thinking about the person listening, and like you may have some really strong values that that you want to impart to your kids, yet you you don't know like what your kid may end up be, as far as like their sexuality, etc., and you want to be accepting of them too, right?
Yeah.
So there may be battling forces
Mm-hmm.
within parents, I suppose, around this. And I think it's interesting, like if we think about this in terms of, well, so for instance, like maybe if you're a listener and, your religion is promotes like heterosexual norms and things like that, and that feels right to you, but um, you're also a parent who has a kid. You listen to the podcast, and you're like, oh, well, I want to love and accept my kid for whoever they are. At some point it's interesting, like there may be a place of saying, well, what is the most important thing to me? You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Is it maintaining that relationship with my kid where I have, um, I have, um, accepting them, I'm showing them love, I'm there as a positive influence in their life, like even as they become young adults and etc. Or is it this value that may, make it so that, you know, that may drive my kids away from me if they become other than the norm that I'm expecting, right? It's interesting.
Absolutely.
So there, and I'm wondering, it's almost like you'd have to like make that choice like pretty early so that you don't inadvertently, you're saying, you may think in your head like I can have both,
Mm.
but kids are really wanting to be accepted
Mm-hmm.
for, I mean, as a parent of teenagers, like wanting to be accepted for who they are. They want that openness. It's a very open world and they want to explore lots of different things. And, for you to be there as a loving support and influence and positive person in their life, like you may have to make a decision early on to to be a little bit more open, practice some more openness and acceptance. Does that make sense, Rachel?
I think it does. I think there are ways in which we never know what our kid is going to come to us with in 20 years to say how we messed up, right? And
Mm.
the difference generationally that I think a lot of folks are experiencing now on like so many different ends, either this idea of boomer parents who aren't willing to take any feedback, and all these millennials who are having to go no contact with their parents, and these millennial parents who are attempting to do some healing work on themselves, and nothing too broad brush. There are plenty of people in all these generations that have bucked all of these norms, but I do think that there's a bit of a culture of, well, I did the best I could, and so why are you telling me about these mistakes? And I think part of it is we're making meaning of our own mistakes as we join this culture of parenthood, and we say, I do think there's a reprioritization that has to happen, because when my kids come to me, I don't want to learn it. I don't want to learn some of these things too late. I don't want to learn some of these things at the expense of my relationship with my child. And
Mm-hmm.
instead, I'd like to be looking ahead and prioritizing the things that I feel like maybe I didn't get, or maybe were extra important to me right now.
Yeah, yeah. What are those words? It's like as we talk about this, like, it makes me think like having an environment that's like open, accepting. I mean, for me, when my daughters were little, I was like really annoyed with the pink and blue thing, like with this like super gendered stuff that was happening. Maybe it's because I was a little bit of a tomboy, which was like a normal, acceptable thing back in the day for girls to be tomboys. But I was a tomboy. I hated pink. And anyway, so I would put my kids in, I have two girls, I would put them in green dinosaur pajamas and whatever, like they had other things, but it was, I did make a conscious effort to like kind of like stem the flow of pink into the house a little bit and like have a variety of different things around the house that were of all the, we had some, we had all kinds of things from all, so it just was like an open and accepting environment, I think, as far as like what are the outer markers of gender. And then I guess for me, it felt, I'm explaining this because it felt like I, I felt like, oh my God, that was the right decision because at 14 or something, my oldest daughter came out to me, and she was like, I thought you already knew, and I was like, no, I didn't. Of course I didn't. But there was some processing, of course, I had to do, and but not a lot, and it was fine, and she always felt safe and fine, and she doesn't have friends who, she has friends who are also LGBTQI plus, and they are not, don't feel safe telling their parents, and I know the kids and I know the parents, and anyway, I just want to say that like making that choice at a young age, I felt like, I mean, it sounds like I'm like being like really egotistical and patting myself on the back, but like, I'm just saying, like, I feel like that was one of the better choices I ever made as a parent.
Right, and you get the gift, right? The gift of your kid feeling comfortable coming to you with that, and to say, I thought you already knew. There's a connection there that I think is really special to have your kid feel so comfortable letting you in on something so important about them.
Yeah. So one of the things you recommend is like for thinking about teaching about gender identity and different types of families, having resources around the house that are just open and inclusive. Is that just a simple way to kind of check that box, or what else?
It's one simple way, right? It is important to teach kids about the existence of queer and trans people and families in their resources, in their communities, in their media, and also just like in conversation about, who we care about in our lives, because like we mentioned, everybody has a gender identity and a sexuality, and giving kids of all identities the opportunity to think about and explore their own is such a gift. Cis kids are not really encouraged to explore their own genders. Straight kids are not always encouraged to explore their own sexualities, and for queer and trans children it can be absolutely life-saving, as we know, and for cis and straight kids it absolutely makes them better allies and accomplices to their friends and to their loved ones. And what we know from various studies of children and adults is that people who have access to this type of information and representation become more empathetic with others, have improved social awareness, confidence. We know from decades of research that as these kids grow to young adulthood, that comprehensive sexuality and consent education reduces STI rates, teen pregnancy and abortion rates, high-risk sexual behavior rates, and even delays sexual activity to begin with. So it kind of goes against that idea that if you teach them, they're just going to want to do it. It's the opposite of what we found. And we know affirmative consent education makes kids safer and more communicative when they enter sexual relationships, hopefully by choice. And it's crucial if we as parents want our children to have healthy, safe, and pleasurable relationships with sex, whether it's with ourselves or whether it's with themselves or other people, to open the lines of communication and make yourself as a parent a safe person to come to first.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's so true, and I've been pushed by podcast guests in the past to like actually have my own conversations with my kids, which I'm like, okay, I'll do it. I just talked to Amy Lang. I'll make sure I have this. Go talk to my kids now. I'm like, okay, yes. Guys, I just talked to a guest. I got to tell you some things. Anyway, it's like a way for me to do it. And dear listener, you should use these episodes as a way to push yourself to do it too. But yeah, it's interesting. One thing I think about now, like now that my girls are 14 and 17, we've talked about so many different things, that really get into adult territory.
Mm-hmm.
And But one of the things that I think is a difference in the way we think about sex now, right? We think, we always in the past, like I had the, like, what was it? Where do I come from book? Did
Uh-huh.
you have that book? I
Sure.
loved that book. Oh my God. It was such a great book. This like kind of tubby, like husband and wife are just like they're so cute. And it describes like an orgasm as like, it feels like a tickle that just like, and then anyway, or like a sneeze.
Oh, I
And
love
I always
the
thought
ones
that
that
was
say
like such
sneeze.
a
That's so
sneeze
crazy.
is a great analogy. And that makes me like so excited every time I have a sneeze. I'm like, woo! Ah, I just sneezed.
What kind of sneezes are you having?
But yeah, just this idea. I guess like this is kind of beyond the podcast. Now I'm like, Rachel, help me with my own kids. But like, um, the idea of sex as something that's beyond reproduction, but is something about pleasure.
Yes.
The conversation to me that feels so beyond awkward.
Oh,
It like it just feels like to I mean, I think we can talk about it like obliquely and like maybe joke about it via movies and stuff like
sure.
that. But like is anyway, are there things that we should just wait until we're 25 to talk about?
It depends. Like, would you want your daughters to wait until 25 to have pleasurable sex?
No, no. I
Because
mean,
that's the thing,
if they
right?
want
This
to, but
is
yeah.
this is so revolutionary, and I fully credit these wonderful two sex educators, Dr. Charles and Amy Myron, who are this couple that team teaches human sexuality in matching sweatsuits, and they led a retreat when I was 14 years old, and they were my mentors. They're kind of the reason that I got into this stuff. And I remember my mom going to their parent session of this retreat that they were going to lead, and the Myrons asked all of the parents in the room, raise your hands if you would like your children to have positive sexual relationships in their lives. And like my parents, like,
Yeah.
most of the parents like raised their hands pretty immediately. But I don't think that we think about our role in helping that be true, because we don't want to think about it. And we also, like, just as much as our kids don't want to think about us having sex, like, we definitely don't want to think about their sex lives either. And there's a way to sort of bracket a bit of, I'm not visualizing any of that. But practically, logically, and emotionally, I want that for them. Of course you do. You want them to be fulfilled. You want them to be happy. And I think most people would agree that a pleasurable, having pleasure in their sex would be something that we would want for them. We don't want them to be having traumatic sex. We don't want them to be having painful sex. We don't want them to be having terrible sex. And our role in that is to offer conversation and offer education and offer freedom and exploration and kind of leave it to them, but encourage that that's just something we wish for them, and that if there's any way that we can guide them to the right resource or help them find what they need to help them achieve whatever they want safely and in a healthy way, that is actually our role. And when we go silent and when we lean into the awkwardness, or when we're, like, what do you mean my teenager like has a sex toy, la la la, like I would never buy my you know what I mean, like what do you want your role to be in helping them help themselves and helping them, they're going to get this information somewhere. And if the information that they're getting from society is that, as women their pleasure doesn't matter, or that as women their pleasure comes second, like, ew, we don't want that for our kids. We don't want our kids to enter sexual relationships thinking, terrible values, or, that they should devalue themselves or their own pleasure.
Okay, so with my 17-year-old, I could say something to the effect of, hey,
It's already going great, Hunter. You're doing great.
she'll be like in her room knitting, and I'll be like, hey, honey, I just want you to know I want you to have pleasurable sexual experiences in your life, and if I can be a resource for that, let me know. I have some, maybe, I could help you find some resources.
Yeah, I think that's a great start. I mean, I think You can sort of name that. You could also
Yeah.
just ask some questions like, if you watch media together, I find this is such a beautiful way in, right? We always want to be critiquing the media for what they're doing wrong and then like kind of giving thumbs up for when they do it right. And if you're watching a movie with your teens or your tweens and you see a perfect example, which we often do, of like consent being ignored or like in sex scenes, if you're like kind of shielding your eyes because you don't want to be watching a certain thing next to your teen but you are, instead of shielding your eyes and waiting for that scene to be over, to be able to, again, like you said, keep it light, keep it jokey, and say, where was the foreplay? Hi, like that was a little quick. Like I don't think, and maybe that involves a conversation about like, yeah, most people with vulvas and vaginas like don't go straight for penetration. Like what just happened there? That didn't look like it was fun, or it should have been as fun as it looked, and sure, there's awkward conversations when you're just sitting down being like, I don't know what to say to each other, but media can be a great way to have a very light conversation about like, that really didn't look like it looks in real life. Have you ever, heard of somebody like having an orgasm, a simultaneous orgasm with their partner every single time? Like the people with that anatomy, that's not how it really works. And 17-year-olds aren't often told that. They enter sexual relationships thinking that that's how it should be. That's what we've seen, that no foreplay is needed, that we're going right to penetration, and that within, 40 seconds that both people are having orgasms. And that's not what's happening in real life. And that's definitely not what the 17-year-old boys or, other folks with other anatomy are seeing in porn.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think that's a good idea because we're on a movie kick. So maybe we'll use that. My 14-year-old and I actually watched Bridgerton together, so that was like really
amazing.
fascinating.
What an
for
amazing
conversation.
example! If you're caught up on this last season, there's foreplay. There's a lot of
Yeah. There was a losing of virginity that actually looked like pretty
pretty
okay to me.
realistic.
Yeah. Pretty
Yeah.
realistic to me.
And to point that out when they do it well, to be able to say, this person is taking their time, this person is focusing on only their partner's pleasure. Whoa.
Yeah.
That's so refreshing to see. Or like I hope that, when you enter into sexual relationship, that you feel like somebody can look at you the way that, they look at each other there. Like there's something to be celebrated when there's something to be celebrated, and there's something to be critiqued, like so much more of the time.
All right. I think I'm going to go for option B.
Yeah.
Rachel, this has been so much fun talking to you. I really, really appreciate it. Rachel's books are the Everybody Book and the Everybody Book of Consent. You can get both of them now. Rachel, any final things that we missed, and also where can people find you if they want to reach out?
Definitely. I think if I were to distill some of the most important things to help keep in mind to teach kids about consent and about keeping their bodies safe, I think there are a couple of pieces. Early on, using correct names for body parts is an evidence-based way to keep kids safe and talking. Identifying safe adults and encouraging asking for help is another. Talking early and often and directly about consent in a non-sexual context and then in its sexual context as your kids age. Like we were just talking about, critiquing all of the ways that people and systems around us and our media get things wrong, and when they get things right, I think is super important. And I really love to highlight my kid's responsibility to keep other people's bodies safe from himself, because especially with daughters, I'm sure so much of the narrative around keeping our own bodies safe, and especially girls, people socialized as girls and women, so much of it can miss the mark because it's only half of the conversation. And if we're entering into a relationship with another person, we have a mutual responsibility of safety. So being able to be a safe person in addition to keeping yourself safe is a piece of consent education that I also really love to highlight. And I hope that listeners will walk away with a lot of thoughts and feelings about how they would like to nurture these conversations in their own families. And thank you so much for offering the Everybody Book and the Everybody Book of Consent to your listeners in case those resources can be helpful for them. And depending on the age of the listeners' children, I
Yeah,
also
yeah.
love
Tell
to
us the
I love to shout
ages.
out Megan Madison and Corey Silverberg and Janine Sanders, Tyler Feeder, and Rachel Bryan for doing great work in this field, depending on the age of the kids and the resources you're looking for.
Okay, awesome. So rewind that section you just heard, play it a few times so you can
I
write
talk
down those
fast.
names.
And people can
Rachel,
find me on my website, rachelsimon.therapy.com. I do love my psychotherapy job with my clients every day. I also do some sex ed teaching and then consulting for organizations and PTAs and parent groups all the time. And I love it.
awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks again for having me.